So what is research, and how does it relate to our work in project-based learning? Well, as an element of PBL, research is about teaching our students how to ask questions, seek out research-based answers, and then share that information with each other and you. This element enhances our students' learning in a variety of ways. First, by teaching our students the value of asking questions, we're building their confidence as learners, increasing their understanding of the content, and teaching the students how to seek out new information instead of only ever coming to us or other adults to find the answers. And this cycle of asking questions, finding answers on their own, and asking new questions, this leads to a growth mindset. And it increases their agency through problem solving. We're teaching them that they can find the solutions to their problems. And all of this promotes the mindset of being a lifelong learner, which is what we really want our students to become. When we teach our students this process of research, we're teaching them how to be critical thinkers, the value of communication, both verbally and written. And we're teaching them how to synthesize, analyze, and organize information that they then need to share with their peers or experts, which would include yourself and other adults in the room possibly. So we break down research into a process, a 3-step process. It's very easy to just say to our students, go do research. But we've broken this down to give you some specific strategies to each of these phases so that you can be mindful of this questioning portion, the discovering, and then the sharing. So questioning. This first phase of research is about teaching our students that we don't know what we don't know, and that we need multiple perspectives of questions. If I simply tell my students, we are going to research how to create a community garden, they might not think any deeper about that. But if I tell them we need to think deeply about what we need to know in order to create a community garden, now they have a space to begin and they're engaged with it. So here are some strategies that we'll talk about. Need to knows, silent questions, and rip, slap, pass. So need to knows. This is about asking our students to write down all of the questions that they have surrounding the topic that we are exploring. You can use the need to knows as a guide for planning resources and activities for students. This gives us sort of a roadmap for content that we need to cover for our students. And then you want to consistently revisit these need to knows, these questions, to see which questions have been answered, and then maybe what new questions should be added. A few years ago, we did a presentation with a group of 9th graders at a local school, and we asked them, what do you need to know to be career ready when you graduate high school? Now that's a very broad question, so we consistently asked a lot of sub-questions throughout the time that we had with each group of 9th graders. But what we got were all of these Post-its, all of the questions that the students had about what they needed to know in order to be career ready. And so then we clustered them, and here's an example of a few of those clusters. They had questions around specific careers. They had questions about what is a job versus a career. And they had questions about job availability. So if I was a 9th grade career course teacher, this is my roadmap for what my content needs to cover this year. This is where my students have questions around this idea of what do they need to know to be career ready. So I've provided myself a roadmap. So another option is the silent questions, something that we just have them do perhaps individually at their desks, writing things on Post-its, and then you can add them to the board later. So you just take your driving question, how might we create a community garden, and break that down into a few sub-questions to just prompt that student thinking. So for this, we might ask, what are possible locations? What do we need for a garden? What are our community resources? We're just asking our students to think about other questions that come up regarding this topic. And then one more version of questioning would be doing rip, slap, pass. And this is something that you can use in a variety of elements of PBL. So for rip, slap, pass, you put your students into small groups and give each one sticky notepad to share. One person writes down their question on the sticky notepad, they rip off that note, slap it in the middle of the table, and pass the pad. And then you repeat this rapidly. And so the point of really all three of these questioning strategies is about giving our students space to ask questions and to ask questions before they're influenced by what their peers are asking. So it's important that we give our students a private, quiet space to ask questions and think about what their questions are, and then to have a place to look at those questions so that we can respond to them and use that as we move into our next phase of research. And our next phase is discovering. So I have an idea of what I need to learn. Now, how do I learn that? So in this phase, this discovering phase, we're teaching our students that agency of conducting their own research, and we're teaching them to learn how to find answers to their questions. Now, before we get into a few strategies, I want to remind you about UDL and culturally sustaining education. It's just important to remember that anytime we are presenting resources for our students, we want to be mindful of UDL. So we want multiple means of representation. We want audio, we want text, we want websites, we want magazines. We want our students to be able to share that learning verbally, by writing things down, doing a recording. We just always want to be mindful of how we are designing for all of our students. And thinking about our culturally sustaining educational approach, we want to make sure that we are reflecting our students' interests and needs. And that varies based on what you're researching, but it's really important for us to always be mindful that we are presenting information for our students to learn about. We are essentially the gatekeepers of what they get to learn about. And so we don't want to keep them from knowledge and resources that connects to them and that is interesting to them. So let's talk about those strategies for discovering. So the first option is curated resources. We are pulling together resources for our students so that they can then dig into these resources and learn. So create a list of sources, consider the varied skill levels, think about that multiple means of representation, right? So text, audio, video, and then create a space where the students have access to that. Maybe it's a wiki. A lot of you are using Google Classroom, just any place where all of your students can find that information consistently. It's helpful to have it in one place. If I'm giving my students space to do research, it's important that I give them some guide rails. So deadlines and checklists is an important strategy to use while my students are discovering their information. Start with small deadlines. Use a checklist that helps keep your students on track. Maybe you have weekly or bi-weekly deadlines to help your students manage their time and stay focused. And then these checklists can help remind the students of what they are looking for while they're doing their research. Here's an example. So if my students are doing research for a research paper, use something like this, or you could create your own. This gives us a better idea of perhaps what our students need to be adding in to their research project as a whole. This is their checklist as they're going through a resource. I want them to identify the source, write down 3 major ideas, and write down a question that I still have. One more routine is the strategy called +1. Now, for this one, this is useful after perhaps everybody has encountered a piece of information together. So maybe as a class, everybody has read a text or watched a movie or listened to something together. And then each student creates a list of ideas that they learned from the text that the class has listened to, read, or viewed. Then they pass their paper to another student. We're doing this in small groups. They pass their paper to another student. That student reads the list of information that's created and then add another of their own key takeaway. So you pass your papers around the group. When you get your paper back, you go back over the entire list and then add new thoughts that they've gained from this exercise. You could do this in probably 10 minutes. It's a pretty basic way to get your students to think about what they've learned and then also share that with somebody in a very informal way. So this strategy is kind of a discovering and sharing strategy. Thinking more about how we are discovering information around us and answering our questions, we have place-based discovery. I think it's pretty easy to forget that we're in school buildings where learning is occurring everywhere and it's occurring outside of our classrooms also. And so using place-based discovery is a great way to encourage our students to explore the areas around them and bring that information back. So thinking about how your students can observe and gather information in their close environments. For example, you could ask your students, What does our classroom tell us about our learning community? If I ask my students to walk around the room with the eye of a scientist, and I want them to make observations about what they're seeing, what do we learn about our classroom as we look at what's in our classroom? Perhaps we are learning about biodiversity. We can ask our students to count the types of trees around our school. Then we can learn about what are these different trees? Why do we need a variety of trees? If we are looking at food consumption or waste, you could ask your students to observe the patterns of consumption and waste in the cafeteria. They can identify what are the types of food that students are and are not eating, what is happening to the food when it is thrown away or not eaten, and then we could use that information to improve our food service at the school. We also don't want to forget about our other resources in the building. Our media specialists and librarians. These individuals are passionate about research and they have access to a lot of research. So you can talk with your media specialist, your librarian, or another teacher who might be able to help gather some age-level appropriate information. When we're working with our colleagues in this way, we want to provide background on the project. We want to set expectations ahead of time, prepare to be flexible, always be kind, specific, and helpful. We'll talk more about that in feedback and revision. But it's important that when we're working with our colleagues that we are mindful that sometimes there can be little trouble spots. And so if we give some expectations, if we give our context and background, then we can work well together. And when we're working with our students, we want to remind them of who will be coming in to work with our class, set expectations ahead of time. So when are we going to see this person? What are they going to do with us? And talk about how we always want to be polite and welcoming to all adults. Now, we also have other experts that we can utilize in this discovering phase. Thinking about the topic of your PBL project, who do you know that has expertise in this area? It doesn't have to be a full-fledged professor who has conducted research in this area. It just needs to be someone who has some knowledge and is passionate and can talk to students. When we are thinking about experts that we want to bring in, we want to consider diversity, representation, and age. We want our students to be able to see themselves in the people that we bring into the room, if that's at all possible. And you may have heard this phrase, windows and mirrors. We want our students to be able to see themselves represented. That's a mirror. We also want them to see other opportunities of representation, and that's the windows. And if you can find people who are younger and can relate to your students, that's always helpful too. So here are a few groups to consider. Your colleagues. We know that the other teachers in your building can talk to students. They're a good place to start. And often it's a great way for your students to get to know their teachers in a slightly different way. You can also bring in your own friends or family members, your students' families, former students, students who are in high school or college. Those are great ones to bring in and talk about something. You can reach out to your local businesses, community organizations, and then you also have college students and college professors that you can reach out to. The easiest way is to just do a quick student-centered ask. So you could write an email like this. My students are learning about gardening. Would you be able to spend a little time with them, virtually or in person, sharing what you know? They would appreciate hearing from a real person who is excited about gardening. When you bring in an expert, it's important that you provide them some background to the project, set clear expectations of their role, and tell them what to expect when they meet your students. So if you want your expert to join you in class and simply share for 10 minutes what they know about this topic, and then be open to answering some questions the students may have, then make sure you are clear about that with them. When you are preparing your students for having this expert come in, tell them who's coming and explain the connection to them. How do you know them? Have the students prepare any questions that you want them to ask ahead of time. So you could do a need to know, right? What do we need to know when this expert is coming in? Give them time to write down a bunch of questions so that when your expert says, what questions do you have? It's not just crickets in the room. And then talk to your students about being polite and welcoming to a visitor. Now, we've talked about questioning and discovering, but honestly, your students need to learn how to conduct research. I know most of us, our students don't know how. And so it's important that we go back and make sure we take some time to teach them how to do these things. So we have a few resources for you. The first is Civic Online Reasoning, and this website teaches our students how to navigate misinformation and disinformation, and then think critically about resources and information. So Civic Online Reasoning asks your students these 3 very important questions. Who's behind the information? What's the evidence? And what do other sources say? And they have on their website a variety of lesson plans that your students can walk through individually or that you can download and use. So for example, they have a lesson plan around a massacre that occurred in Texas in 1918. And so in this lesson plan, there are a variety of materials, and it's teaching the students how to learn about the different sources, who's behind it, what is the evidence of these sources, and what do other sources say? So really teaching them to be critical thinkers, to be able to take in information in a positive and critically thinking way. And then we also have Project Zero. Project Zero has a ton of routines for helping our students to actually learn how to do research. So the +1 strategy that I showed you earlier comes from Project Zero. Their website is searchable and it has a great, just a ton of strategies to use. So we've done our questioning, we've done our discovering, now we need to share. It's very important that we provide a space and an opportunity to ask our students to share what they have learned. This keeps them accountable and engaged. It's a great opportunity to practice presenting informally. It gives our students an opportunity to get some feedback from their peers, and it can also spark excitement or curiosity. So you can have them share their information in 3 different ways: anonymously, one-on-one, or in groups. When we do anonymous shareouts, it's helpful because it allows our students to be less self-conscious about their research skills. And if we do one-on-one or group, students can build their verbal communication, their listening, and their presentation skills. So there are different opportunities for skill growth depending on if you are using anonymous, one-on-one, or group shareouts. Anytime you are doing a shareout, it's important that you provide a process for your students to follow. Provide time constraints, prompts or sentence starters, and any handouts that they will need. So here's an example for something you could use on a one-on-one shareout. Partner 1, name your source, give a 30-second summary, and share 2 things that you learned. Partner 2 is going to ask 1 question, and you give them 3 questions to choose from. Why did you choose this source? What surprised you the most from this source? What do you wish was in this source that you still don't know? And then they can have a little conversation. In a large group, you could ask your students to sit together and ask them to share what they've learned in their recent research. Maybe each student shares, 2 students respond with a question, and then after the entire group has shared, each student reflects on what they've learned. So here's an example of what that could look like. So before the share out, students would complete that first part. This week I've read, viewed, listened. From these sources I have learned. They share a few things. And then after everybody has shared and asked questions, we're prompting them to think about what they want to learn about next. So that is research. It's really important that you remember that this portion of the project is about helping your students question, discover, and share knowledge. There are a variety of methods that you can use to help your students conduct research. It's important to just identify 1 or 2 that you feel comfortable with and use them again and again in your classroom. Be mindful of the UDL and culturally sustaining education principles as you're helping your students through this phase. And these strategies that you try, they can be useful not just for your project, but in everyday learning.